Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada's official launch of the COVID story map, mapping the Asia Pacific COVID-19 responses. My name is Jeff Reeves. I'm the Vice President of the Foundation, and I'm pleased to host today's webinar where we'll have three short presentations outlining the rich data sets collated within APF Canada's COVID-19 story map, presented later on by our program managers, Dr. Shiroshi Day, Dongwoo Kim, and Pauline Stern. Before we get started, though, I'd like to just take a few seconds to address some housekeeping issues. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted on our website shortly after the event. If you have any questions during the presentations, please use the question and answer box located at the bottom for questions during the presentation. We will have time for questions in between each presentation and the opportunity for a larger discussion at the end. Given the limited time of today's webinar of 1 hour, if we don't have the chance to answer your question directly, please do feel free to reach out to us online or offline. For technical support during this presentation, please contact events@asiapacific.ca. And while we're meeting today in a global digitalized space, participants logged in from all over the world, including from Europe, South and Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, the United States, and of course from coast to coast across Canada. The Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that the places Canadians call home are the traditional territories of many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Now, we're really excited about this new initiative, and we do encourage you to explore the publication on your own after, of course, this project launch. We'll hope that you'll find what we've put together here is very informative, intuitive, and interactive. So that said, what exactly is the product? Well, starting on March 2020, we realigned our short-term research objectives to respond to the COVID crisis. Now, in line with our mandate, we developed a set of research priorities around COVID in Asia that we believe, and continue to believe, would have value in the Canadian context with respect to Canada's own national and provincial pandemic experiences and responses. Now, specifically, we sought to identify and track Asian nations' pandemic responses and mitigation policies, with the understanding that many Asian states and economies, such as South Korea, Taiwan, China, and Singapore, were weeks, if not months, ahead of Canada with respect to exposures, outbreaks, and policy responses. To better accomplish this, we started developing COVID Asia databases around regional policy responses with the intent of developing Asian state COVID profiles or portfolios. Now, to start, we developed a list of 30 policy variables against which we collected open source data using multiple regional languages from policy speeches, policy statements, media reporting, academic literature, and data sets from local, national, and international sources. We identified these variables through our own comparative analysis of potential policy responses, drawn from our own understanding of public health options, but we also used several other databases from institutions like Oxford and Princeton University that were also interested in helping provide a kind of a global picture around pandemic responses at the state level. Next, we drafted a list of 56 countries we identified as being part of Greater Asia, including all the Pacific Island nations, all Central Asia, and some parts of the Middle East. Now, our intent here was to identify as broad a sampling of Asian economies as possible to enhance our ability to undertake comparative analysis. We then started our process of data collection with a specific focus on measures we believed most relevant to Canada's experience, like the use of technology and contact tracing and school closures, for instance, and with respect to the data that was, of course, publicly available. Through this approach, we developed 5 unique data sets that we overlaid with real-time data from Johns Hopkins on COVID morbidity and mortality, and with our own data on Canadian investments in Asia down to the city level. Our data sets in this current iteration include the testing policies and practices in each Asian country, movement and travel restrictions, school closures, mask wearing policies, mobile apps tracking. Now, let me briefly speak about the way we decided to present this data. Rather than draft our findings in a report, we opted to use a geographic information system platform to develop what's called a story map. Now, you might have seen this type of product in the New York Times or in the Financial Times in reports on more complex topics that have kind of a geographic component, such as stories about, for example, territorial disputes in places like the South China Sea. Geographic information systems, or GISs, allow for different user experiences, one that uses mixed media to tell a simple story, but incorporating very complex data sets. Now, through this platform, we were able to embed our data sets into maps, which in turn allow users to essentially customize their interaction with the data. So rather than keep describing the project at this point, we've prepared a very short video to introduce its features and functions, and I hope this will provide some clarity around the product. So one area to note with respect to this project is that this is ongoing and multi-directional. We're continuing to collect additional data around pandemic response, and we'll publish a second compendium piece to our current finished COVID story map. But we're also developing similar modules on pandemic recovery with respect in particular to Asian states' approaches to economic recovery. Now, towards this end, we'll soon be publishing a data set and story map around tariff rates on products across the CPTPP member economies to measure economic competitiveness in post-COVID Asia. And we're working with ChinaUS on this project and hope to have something out in a matter of weeks. But without any further delay, let me hand the stage over to our program managers, without whom we wouldn't have been able to put these data sets together. Starting with Dr. Shiroshi Day, who will talk about movement restrictions, then moving on to Mr. Dongwoo Kim, who will talk about COVID-19 mobile apps, and then finishing up with Ms. Pauline Stern, who will speak on Canadian investment in Asia with respect back to this COVID map. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shiroshi Day, and I'm the Program Manager of the Perspectives Asia Pillar. And I manage all that's to do with public opinion research. Thank you very much for attending our webinar today. I'm glad to have been a part of this project since its conception. I worked with multiple research team members on this amazing project, and I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the hard work and contribution made by each of them. Now that we have walked through a bit about how the story map works, and you have seen all the different functionalities that are built in it as shown in the video and explained by Jeff, let's talk about the data behind these story maps. When we first started with this lockdown, all of us were impacted. Hand washing, face covering, social distancing, these became the new normal as countries moved to flatten the curve. Among many of those factors to affect us, one was domestic movement restrictions. We were asked to avoid public spaces with large public gatherings such as public transit. This led to reduced ridership, reduced frequencies, and in some jurisdictions, complete restriction on movement impacted the society greatly. Social gatherings with large groups was restricted and in some places even banned. Meeting in restaurants with friends and colleagues or even families was restricted. Restaurants, offices, community spaces all but shut down. Stay home, stay safe became the new normal. It was a required measure to protect us from COVID-19. However, with such policies being implemented, we realized that social gathering bans have profound effects on the economy and society, as evidenced over the past couple of months. And we began collecting data around this since April to maintain a record of how the jurisdictions are responding to the crisis over time. So, we collected data on stay-at-home policies, which differed greatly across jurisdictions. We tracked this data for 56 jurisdictions and found that some 16 jurisdictions had no stay-at-home policies in the month of May, 15 advised stay-at-home for symptomatic and at-risk people, 18 jurisdictions advised stay-at-home for all individuals, while 7 jurisdictions introduced night curfews, which is curfews which would be from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. Moving on, apart from stay-at-home policies, we considered some of the other factors that are impacting movement restrictions. We started putting together data on the maximum size of social gathering allowed, which differed greatly by jurisdiction. We found data to suggest that these sizes varied from less than 1, basically implying don't go outside your bubble, to well over 1,000. In the graph, we see some of the Asia-Pacific jurisdictions and their varying maximum allowed sizes over the month of May. At the lowest end, we have Singapore with 1 as the maximum size of social gathering, while on the other side, we have China, India, Japan, South Korea, who have banned mass gatherings. We used the World Health Organization definition of mass gatherings of 1,000 people for a standardized number. We have collected such data on 45 jurisdictions and continue to update this on a monthly basis. Furthermore, in terms of domestic movement restriction, an interesting variable was interregional movements within each jurisdiction, such as restriction on travel between states and India that led to the hardship of thousands of migrant workers across the country. We saw their images splashed across newspapers as they walked miles to reach their homes located in distant villages. So, we gathered data on interregional movement as well within each jurisdiction. We broadly categorize this kind of qualitative data into 3 categories: no restrictions or no enforcement of restrictions, as in the red pie; targeted checkpoints at specific regions, provinces, cities, or islands, that is the blue pie, that is 20% of the jurisdictions had targeted restrictions; then the general checkpoints, which are in place to restrict the interregional movement across the country, the orange pie. Please note, restrictions on interregional movement do not necessarily mean that movement is banned. It also includes checkpoints that are just there to assess the traveler's health. Having collected data on these 3 variables, we pulled together a map using the Geographical Information System to help visualize the cumulative effect of these variables and understand how the policies differed across these jurisdictions. At a glance, this map provides an overview of the domestic travel restrictions present within each jurisdiction. The diamond-shaped symbols depict whether the jurisdictions have any stay-at-home policy nationwide. Green would mean absent, orange means advised, red would mean enforced, and purple would mean a night curfew. We further gathered data on allowed gathering size. Larger the diamond size, more the number of people allowed to gather in that jurisdiction. For example, Taiwan has no stay-at-home policy and allows groups of up to 500 to gather at their own discretion. This map further contains data on interregional travel restrictions. Some countries, like India, which is in red here, have travel checkpoints set up throughout the country to monitor interstate movement. Others, like China in yellow, have fewer such checkpoints, while Australia in green has no restrictions on interprovincial movement. This data is changing fast, however. Australia has recently introduced restrictions, and we will be revising this data set to reflect the same. This is an ongoing process, as mentioned earlier. We endeavor to collect these data every month and update the visualizations accordingly. As shown in the video, clicking on the jurisdictions will provide more information on their policies in separate pop-up text boxes. Now, we collected data on major Asian economies to small island nations such as Fiji, Kiribati, and Guam. In India, the hard lockdown and stay-at-home order announced in March led the spread of the novel coronavirus to slow down in a highly populous country. Over the months, the government slowly relaxed various policies, including stay-at-home orders for everyone. By the month of May, the order was removed, but through various other policies, such as restrictions on mass gatherings, interregional movement, and strategies such as marking out zones throughout the country, the government kept a control on people's movement. Now, with domestic movement restrictions, the direct impact could be seen on many scales. Some of the obvious that being on manufacturing companies, hospitality and tourism, schools, and even small businesses. According to Statistics Canada, around 60% of small businesses have reported 20% decline in their revenues over the past months. And yet another impact of such domestic movement restrictions can be seen in repatriation efforts. One country's domestic movement restrictions and policies could affect another country's economy. So we explored Canadian repatriation efforts from India, and in its initial stages, we could see that the Canadian consulate hit roadblocks of various forms, one of the largest being that of checkpoints that did not allow interregional movements. Canadians flying back from India reported requiring letters from consulates to be able to move out. Poor communication and lack of proper transportation during those months impeded the efforts. As of June 15th, according to the High Commissioner for Canada to India, around 13,000 travelers have returned to their homes in Canada from India. Canadian government continues to work with the Indian government in securing flights for repatriation as both the countries work towards that effect. Now, one may ask, what are the implications? According to the data we gathered, at the end of May, about a third of countries in the Asia Pacific had restrictions on gatherings of 100 or less. Also, about half of the countries were advising or requiring everyone to stay at home at all times. But this is fast changing. As the curve in many countries is going down, they are starting to relax rules and open up. Canada is not far behind. Experts fear that as we open up, another outbreak is close for many. So question is, how can such data visualization help? At a glance, we can see the current movement restrictions in place in each jurisdiction. As we saw in case of India, restrictions on regional movement plus night curfews, combine that with international points of entry data, a data set we are collecting, we can have a better understanding of how the country is operating on the ground. This in turn can help inform our current engagements, such as in case of trade and investment, and build investment analysis, a point to which my colleague Pauline would expand further. It can also disrupt travel plans and affect tourism industry. Coupled with various other data sets such as case count, one can also trace the trend for how each jurisdiction is faring in terms of tackling the outbreak. This can in turn help policymakers consider policies that can help contain the outbreak, such as contact tracing. Now, the COVID story map comprises of multiple other data sets and maps such as testing policies, mask wearing policies, school closures, and even mobile applications, a topic on which my colleague Dongwoo will be talking further. And with that, I shall bring my segment to a close and pass the mic back to Jeff.
Thank you, Shiroshi, for a great presentation. We can take questions during the presentations. If you do have one, please go ahead and type it into the question and answer box in Zoom. But just to start you off, Shiroshi, I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on the relationship between movement restrictions and tourism, and perhaps maybe even reference back to Canada's tourism industry going into the summer. I know a lot of people are quite interested in how that's going to play out, or at least your perspective of that.
Yeah, sure. So Jeff, as I mentioned, that this data set essentially is talking about the domestic movement restriction. Now, in terms of Canada, what we found is that tourism contributes around 2% to the Canada's to the country's GDP, and we also found that 78% of total tourism spending in Canada comes from domestic travelers. So domestic movement restrictions can impact tourism greatly. The travel restrictions have already impacted the tourism industry, and cancellations of conferences, conventions are already costing millions of dollars. So if domestic movement restrictions remain in place, then the travel experience is impacted, which in turn impacts economies dependent on tourism. International trips to Canada in 2020 have also been cut by 49% from Asia and 33% from Oceania as compared to the first 4 months of 2019. For countries such as China, Australia, India, where the GDP contribution of tourism is significant, the impact will be large. And for tourism-dependent smaller island nations, which they will also be severely affected, such as Vanuatu, which has 48% of its GDP contribution from tourism, or Fiji, where the contribution is almost 39%.
Thank you for that very much. Okay, without any more questions, we'll move on to the next presenter, Mr. Dongwoo Kim, who will be speaking about COVID-19 mobile apps. So over to you, Dongwoo.
Okay, thank you, Jeff, and thank you everyone for giving me the space to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing at Digital Asia. So my name is Dongwoo Kim, and I'm the program manager for this pillar. I work with Tracy Lee and Daniela Rodriguez, who are both postgraduate research scholars at the foundation, and they've contributed tremendously to this data set and beyond. And I would like to, acknowledge their contribution for this part. But anyways, mobile apps. Why did we do it? So our team had been following the use of mobile apps in COVID-19 response pretty early on during the outbreak. Next slide, please. So we have written about how South Korea, Singapore, and Vietnam have used the mobile in their response to the COVID-19 outbreak, and those are the countries that have been highlighted as being the success cases during the past few months. But beyond that, there is a broader context that we also wanted to highlight. Next. So in the Asia Pacific, we're seeing the trend where governments are increasingly relying on mobile applications in order to deliver for policy delivery. So in Southeast Asia, the internet penetration rate grew from 25% to 63% in the last 5 years, driven by introduction of affordable mobile devices and subscription plans. So in this context, especially the lower income governments are looking at mobile applications as a way of delivering services that they were not able to do so because of the lack of capacity or resources. So we're seeing delivery of public health services, financial services, and also e-commerce in this area. So what we wanted to do in this context was to embrace this enthusiasm for mobile apps within the Asia Pacific and see how they used it in order to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. So we've categorized the COVID-19 applications into 3 different types. The first one, informational, where the government is mostly providing information to the users. And then monitoring and reporting. This is one where individuals who are under specific quarantine or self-isolation orders are updating relevant government officials about their health data or location data. And then finally, contact tracing. So this one we're a little more familiar with. Ontario / Government of Canada will be introducing this type of application here as well. But basically, this type of applications allow public health officials to track people who have come into contact with confirmed COVID-19 patients. So in the map, you can, could we go back one slide, please? Yeah, so in the map, we've depicted contact tracing by a layer of a white shade. And you can see that there is a significant number of countries that have decided to go with contact tracing mobile applications. Okay, next slide, please. And the story map will also has the feature of showing some of the in-depth analysis that we've done on some of the mobile app uses in the Asia Pacific. So for example, for Singapore, once you zoom in, you'll get a little blurb about the dispatch that we wrote, and then it'll link you to our 1,000-word piece on Singapore and South Korea's use of mobile app in the COVID crisis. And also for countries where we did not have an opportunity to write longer pieces, we've provided blurbs providing you with a snapshot of the COVID-19 and mobile app related information. So here's the info about Australia, and then the one about Bhutan. So the data sets, the map demonstrates that it's not just the wealthier or tech savvy usual suspects developed economies that are using mobile applications in response to COVID-19, but also a lot of lower income countries that are resorting to the use of the apps. And globally, COVID-19 crisis has really become has really driven the trend of data collection and usage. Not that this was not a thing before, but now with the COVID-19 crisis, there seems to be a greater momentum behind that kind of practice. So for many technocrats, techno-optimists, this might be something exciting, but from our perspective, we see some concerns. So the first question that I would ask is, is this emergence or reliance on mobile applications an indicator that governments are opting to throw apps at a problem where more fundamental investment in infrastructure and human resources are required, like in healthcare in rural areas? Or, next slide, please. There are questions about privacy. We have a lot of governments collecting and using people's health data in this crisis, and in a lot of developed economies, they are contracting well-known cybersecurity firms in order to ensure that the data is not leaking and that it doesn't fall in the hands of hackers. But what about lower income countries? And what about countries where the privacy regime is not as strong as in other places? So that's another concern. And then finally, next slide, please. We have there are concerns about expansion of state surveillance, and this is particularly a concern in countries where the rule of law is weak and where democratic institutions have been eroding. So that's most of my the content from this presentation. As you can see in the story map and the analysis, the digital is really spilling over to other areas, the political, the social, and the economic. And all of those will have varying degrees of implications for Canada. And from our end, Digital Asia team will be following these developments closely, and we would really welcome your input on what kind of data set you'd be interested in seeing on our story map or other types of research topics that you'll be keen to learn about more. So thank you very much for your time, and that's it from my end.
Dongwoo, thanks so much. Again, please go ahead and enter any questions that you might have for the speakers into the Q&A box. But in the meantime, I wonder if, Dongwoo, would it be possible for you to give us kind of a broad strokes scope of some of the debates within the Asia Pacific around privacy in particular, and what are you seeing in terms of privacy and that kind of approach in the region?
Oh, okay. So this is my favorite type of question, in the sense that I can say that there is a lot of nuance and that it's much more complicated than a simple answer. But there are lots of things in play: cultural issues and historical experiences and trusting governments. In some of the countries in Asia, we're seeing that the governments are either imposing this kind more strict data collection and usage, regardless of individual consent, or we are seeing citizens who are much more open to this type of data use in the name of public good. So it's really, really nuanced, and it'll be wrong to characterize it as being one thing or other. But broadly speaking, there is a greater acceptance, and that some of the things that we could attribute that, some of the attributions that we could make is first, trusting governments. States like South Korea or Singapore or Vietnam, they've dealt with this COVID crisis really well. And part of that entailed some of the measures that would be seen as violation of personal privacy in North America. And the media in those countries are highlighting how the failures in some of the Western countries. And there seems to be a greater confidence or trust in their and pride in their governments. And that seems to justify what has been done. Of course, we should also acknowledge that there are many civil society organizations that are trying to limit more intrusive collection and use of data within those countries, but those debates are not as salient as they are in North America or Europe, where individual rights and privacy are much more deemed to be much more important. So yeah, the short answer is it's complicated.
Thanks, Dongwoo. So we'll move now into the final presentation. Ms. Pauline Stern will talk a little bit about mapping Canadian investment in the Asia Pacific, again, with specific reference back to the COVID crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Hello, everyone. I'm Pauline Stern, the Program Manager for Business Asia at the Foundation. I'll be giving you a brief overview of our investment data that the Foundation has brought onto the ArcGIS platform and how this data interacts with my colleagues' COVID policy tracker datasets. And we'll also be telling you a little bit about the new economic datasets that we will be releasing over the course of the summer. The goal of the dataset I will be discussing shortly, as well as our upcoming economic datasets, is to highlight the impact of COVID-19 and COVID-related health policies on Canadian economic interests in the Asia-Pacific, as well as highlight the present and growing economic ties between Canada and Asia. So the first economic dataset that we have brought onto the ArcGIS platform is the APF Canada Investment Monitor. This dataset is part of a project that tracks and analyzes two-way investment flow between Canada and the Asia-Pacific region from 2003 to present. The database uses a bottom-up approach and tracks investment at the establishment level. So tracking Canadian companies that are purchasing, merging, or starting a new company in the Asia-Pacific. For example, a Canadian company setting up a manufacturing facility, or a Canadian retailer opening up a store in Asia. Showing this deal flow dataset on ArcGIS in parallel with our COVID-related datasets allows Canadian businesses and policymakers to answer two important questions. One, how will Canadian economic interests be impacted by local public health measures? And two, if so, what is the scale of the potential disruption? So the dataset covers deal flow from 2003 to now, and at present has recorded 3,451 Canadian deals in the Asia-Pacific, worth over a combined value of $411 billion. The database offers city-level granularity, showcasing point-to-point economic ties. From the database, we know that Canadian companies located in 97 cities across Canada have invested in 477 Asia-Pacific locales. This really brings home the economic interconnectedness of Canada with Asia, and during this current COVID pandemic serves to highlight the current exposure Canadian communities have to municipal level outbreaks occurring in cities in Asia. The financial welfare of a Canadian investment and ability to flow money back to its headquarters, located in one of those 97 Canadian communities, will be significantly impacted by how the pandemic is playing out on the ground in Asia. So where do Canadian businesses' economic interests lie in the Asia-Pacific? From 2003 to present, the largest destinations for Canadian investment dollars in the Asia-Pacific have been Australia, accounting for 32%, mainland China at 20%, India at 12%, Hong Kong at 4%, and Vietnam at 3%. The main sector that Canada is investing in the Asia-Pacific is the finance industry, a majority of which is invested in commercial real estate, such as shopping malls and other areas whose foot traffic is highly affected by local COVID health policies. Another important consideration that this dataset helps bring to light is that Canadian investment in the Asia-Pacific is not all private sector companies. Canadian state-owned enterprises are making up an increasingly important share of Canadian investment in the region. In the most recent 4-year period, Canadian SOEs have accounted for nearly half of all the value of Canadian investment in the region. Investing Canadian SOEs mainly come in the form of public pension funds such as the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board. Outbreaks of COVID and the public health policies surrounding it impact these pension funds' Asian investments and in turn, the Canadian public for whom the fund is held. When you lay out the Canada-Asia investment relationship on our new ArcGIS platform, it shows yet another important COVID-related exposure. The split between the value of deals flowing to rural versus urban destinations is increasingly shifting towards urban environments. Recently, around 3/4 of deals have been destined for urban environments, the exact same environments that are most prone to COVID-related lockdown measures. As we continue to analyze our datasets on ArcGIS and the interaction between these datasets, we can better understand the impact of, for example, mask-wearing policies on foot traffic to Canadian retail investments in the Asia-Pacific, such as looking at Hong Kong's mask-wearing population adherence rate and Canadian retail sector FDI on Hong Kong, which is worth $3.2 billion. In the coming weeks and months, we will be launching several novel datasets, which are the culmination of much research and data gathering from both our in-house research teams and our research collaborators, specifically a CPTPP product competitiveness tracker, which will allow users to search for their product's six-digit HS code to find the new tariff rates and how the relative competitiveness of their product has changed as a result of this free trade agreement. We'll also have a dataset on South Korea's economic ties to Canada, as well as datasets on Canada's federal and provincial-led trade missions, Canada's twinning city relationships, and bilateral student flows between Canada and Asia. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you.
Pauline, thanks so much. We do have a couple questions that have come in from the audience, so I'll go ahead and put them open to all of the panelists, although at least in one instance, one is directed to Dongwoo specifically, so it'd be great to make sure that he has a chance to comment on that. So the first is, let me hear you. So is it possible to convert the function of storymap from providing timely encyclopedia data at the global level to analysis of information on policies implemented by governments throughout the globe, based on criteria such as social, economic, security, public health, and civil liberty, etc.? So, I mean, I actually could take a first crack at that and then turn it over to the panelists. When you do, and hopefully everybody will follow on and visit our website and have a chance to actually get into the story map and leaf through the different functions of this map. But as you'll see, we not only provide the data sets and very, I think, intuitive maps that result from those data sets, but we actually have analysis built into those maps as well. So for example, on contact tracing, when we look at, or the use of mobile apps, we show what's happening at the state level, at the operational level within each Asia-Pacific nation or economy. But then we also break down to different levels of analysis at the city level, or even in some instances at the local level. And then we do reference that back to the specific issues with respect to social or political or economic implications. So for one instance, we have data about outbreaks that have happened in Seoul, identified, geolocated, and geotagged down to the actual block within the city where the occurrence took place. And then we provide analysis around it that touches on things like privacy, like inclusion, and of course with reference back to the socioeconomic implications of the outbreak. So yes, the map has a lot more data than just what we've demonstrated, I think, through this presentation. The maps are at the heart of that, but we've taken, I think, a lot of pains to make sure that we've provided context, not just demonstrating through symbology where these effects are taking place, but also providing analysis around a whole different range of issues. So that's my first chop at that question. Does anybody have anything to add?
Sure, I can go. Yeah, similar. Like for the data that we collected from Digital Asia, this is all. We're trying to provide more context in case of the mobile apps and the privacy issues. It's not something that you could just give the full picture by just showing 1-0 or 1-0, whether the category is yes or no. So we wanted to make sure to include like longer blurbs that give you more context behind the policies and the sort of like discussions about these apps. And something that our team is looking into doing, we've collected some a series of information on what kind of post-COVID policies are coming out of Asia, like addressing the digital. And like we're hoping to see if we can somehow present this in a map format as well. So very much in mind and very good point. Thank you very much.
I'd just add one other thing. If you do visit our website, you will see that we have an additional interactive map up called our COVID Asia Tracker. And what we've done with this is actually by country list all of our different analytical products that have come out with respect to COVID, with respect to that country. So we've taken a lot of the reporting that we've done through our Asia Watch tri-weekly mail out, which if you're not a subscriber, I would encourage you to get online and subscribe to. We've taken all the reporting that we've done on COVID and we've mapped it. So you can go there and it's a single point of entry where you can find out all the things that we've written on China, on Japan, on any Asia Pacific nation or economy. And you can get a better understanding of some of the qualitative work that we've done in this space. But a lot of those products are also cross-posted in this COVID map. And again, I think just take some time and look through, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised how much qualitative analysis there is in support of the data that we presented. So I can put out a little bit, some more questions. Dongwoo, wondering whether or not there will be a story map that signals the usage of other tracking technologies, such as the use of wristbands or QR codes, registration in Korea, for example.
Yeah, if we had more capacity, for sure, very aware of the fact that it's not just the mobile apps, but also, the types of government programs that do contact tracing, or as you mentioned, the wristbands, the QR codes. There are many interesting dimensions, and for now we have to focus on one specific area, so that's why we went with mobile. But again, if you could take some time to read our blurbs, it'll mention how those things are related to the mobile apps, are related to broader measures put in place. But hopefully we'll get to addressing more interesting things like the wristbands and the scanning of QR codes moving forward.
So another question. Is there any plan for collaboration with higher education institutes for the research part of this project? I'll take a crack at that. Absolutely, we would look for partnership and opportunities for broader engagement where and when we can find them. There was, at least from our perspective, an impetus to get this data out publicly as quickly as possible. When we first started on this project, we saw this primarily as a public good, and we wanted to make sure that we were giving as many inputs as possible from our foundation and in line with our mandate to help the Canadian provincial and central governments and city governments make good decisions around COVID and policy responses as we saw best practices emerging from the Asia Pacific. So there was a very, very, I think, key timeliness concern early on. But I think as we collected this data and as we developed the data and as we put together the story maps, there are very clear opportunities for further research. And we'd be more than interested in working with partners, whether that's in government or in academia or in the business community, where people are interested in learning more or where people feel like we need to further, I think, expand or elaborate on some of the data that we've brought to bear. So absolutely, that's something that we would be more than interested in doing. And please do reach out to us offline if you have an opportunity or interest in partnering. With Pauline, did you see any change in the destination of industry of FDI from Asia to Canada?
Yeah, I'm assuming that means over the entire period 2003 to present, right?
Sure. And okay. I imagine also perhaps maybe speaking a little bit more in terms of the last couple of quarters.
But this is Asian investment into Canada. So the opposite direction that we're mapping. Yep. The short answer is yes, of course. The kind of original major Asian market entering Canada was, of course, Japan entering in the auto sector in the early 2000s. And then we saw that massive kind of boom in natural resources investment interest from China. And then recently, even though natural resources are still an incredibly important share of inward investment, we've seen a greater diversification out to computer services and software investment in Canada, especially that 2016 to 2019 period, as well as kind of some newer, smaller Asian economies making their first kind of investments in Canada. So yeah, so there's kind of multiple stories, in covering 29 economies coming and investing from the Asia Pacific into Canada. Each of those economies has kind of either a nice big linear investment relationship or certain blips throughout the last decade and a half.
So Pauline, similarly, the next question is for you. Are the economic activities, quantities, qualities compared similarly before and after COVID-19? Is there any data particularly focused on the study of national security regulations, on the study, imposes on the import-export on top of COVID-19, and how are the factors isolated?
Okay, so that's a few really good questions. And the answer is that wait about 2 to 3 months, because the way that investments work is a lot of the investments that did end up going through right in the height of the COVID kind of first wave epidemic back in April, were investments that were already, in that last kind of signing stage. So the impact that it will have and is having on investments is kind of the next few months where we see a decrease in deal closures or people backing out of deals that were very close to being closed. So that is a lot of analysis that we plan to cover over the next kind of 6 months to however long the impact of this lasts. With regards to national security measures, import-export restrictions, things of that nature, yeah, similarly, we're tracking all those policy announcements as they occur. And we expect, obviously, to have massive implications on companies' ability and desire and kind of confidence in investing in certain countries. We can also, though, use historical data that we have when we've seen national kind of security policies come into play in the last decade and a half. Canada has the Invest in Canada Act that cropped up around the mid-2010s. And we saw after that a big decline in natural resource investments. So we can use our past data to make some assumptions about what might be playing out over the next couple of months, but we're also tracking live as those policies are announced.
And then Pauline, the follow-on question to that was, could you speak more specifically towards the Hong Kong, China experience?
To the Hong Kong, China experience? You mean Canadian investment or the security law?
Yeah. But specifically towards Hong Kong and China?
Yeah, so with that, as the business environment in Hong Kong adapts and changes in light of the new rules and regulations that have passed, of course, we expect to see changes in the motivation and ability of Canadian companies to use Hong Kong or to choose alternate mainland China locations to make their direct investments.
Great. And we have gotten a couple of questions about opportunities for collaboration. Again, absolutely. And we'd be more than happy to do that with any institution that would like to talk about how to move forward with some collaboration. Just please do contact us directly after this offline, and we'll follow up with the appropriate people in our office. But again, another question around export competitiveness and the economic component of this. Do the data sets illustrate the impact of the CPTPP and COVID-19 responses on Canadian export competitiveness versus US and key Asian markets? And then also with respect to international students flow to Canada versus US and Australia. So if anybody would like to take a crack at those.
I can take a crack at the first one about exports, specifically CPTPP. Yes, that's a data set that we're working on in partnership with the ChinaUS Foundation, and we'll be doing our first analysis on the Canada-Japan CPTPP relationship. Also, directly how tariff rates are changing and being affected, and how that changes Canadian companies' exports competitiveness compares to other CPTPP members, but importantly compares to US companies and other major global exporters on a product by product basis. So we're going down to the 6-digit HS code. So it's kind of an incredibly specific level of granularity at looking at how the CPTPP is impacting Canadian export competitiveness.
I can speak to the international student data set. So essentially, we are starting to collect some of the data about the international student flows to Canada, US, and Australia, particularly in light of the recent changes that have been announced in the US. It's something that we are interested in exploring further. We have been publishing a couple of qualitative analysis here, so that's something to also look into. But yes, please expect a data set coming shortly on international student flows.
We do have time for a couple more questions if people would like to key them in. In the meantime, Dongwoo, I wonder if I could throw out a question for you. Where we saw, for example, 5G leading to a potential kind of bifurcation of telecommunications usage in the Asia Pacific, those align more towards the Chinese model and those more aligned towards a Western model, for lack of a better term. Do you see the introduction of technology and COVID responses as leading to a similar division within Asia around states that are doing certain things and states that are opting out of certain models? And do you think that we're going to find that the implementation or the introduction of technology leads to further breakdown in spheres of influence, or will we see this as a unifying force across states within the Asia Pacific region?
Really interesting question. Thank you, Jeff. So we'll have to see how this turns out, but for now, I don't think it'll be a bifurcation between China and the US kind of sphere of influence in relation to these COVID apps. More like the one pattern that I've noticed is how Singapore, the Singaporean model of contact tracing has really taken off. And that's like one kind of popular model that we were able to identify all around the world. And then the Singaporean model is an interesting case where it's not entirely like if we had to generalize it grossly. It doesn't really lean towards the Chinese model, or the American model. It's something that kind of stays in between and ends up being reflective of it's the model that ends up being more reflective of the context where the apps are getting deployed. So yeah, that's the only type of a prototype, the only kind of prototype that I'm seeing out there. And on this, specifically on the COVID-19 related apps, I don't think that's the case, but it'll be more of a question of the Asian model where governments are trying to make use of, collect and use this data more aggressively. And then the Western model where governments are trying to tiptoe more carefully around data collection and privacy regulations. So I don't think it'll be a China-US kind of a thing, but more so Asian and rest of the world, or Western.
Great, thank you. We do have time for one more question if somebody would like to queue one up. Okay, otherwise I'll turn over to the presenters and see if anybody would like to make a final comment on any of the questions or clarify any points that they feel like they'd like to go further into.
Jeff, I just noticed Lana Hodgson has a question about industry sector collaboration with our research team.
Yes. Yeah.
So I would just say you are the person she should reach out to.
Absolutely. And like I think we advertised at the beginning of this, we also have general contact information for people that are interested. Otherwise, do please reach out to me directly is fine, or to our business development team. A lot of contact information on the website. And any opportunity for collaboration around these data sets or for data sets that we're putting together moving forward would be more than welcome. And we'll look forward to talking more with those individuals who did indicate that there were some interest in collaboration. I think we got one more question that we could. Okay, so for the last question, we'll go here with any current policies in place may create certain legislations or health-related regulations coming out of the current pandemic.
Oh, could I take this one?
Yes.
So interesting legislations we've seen in Asia are the pandemic-specific laws that have been the basis of data collection by Asian governments. I don't think I've looked into it, and there has not been a similar legislation in Canada. I think we've acted on the directives of the Prime Minister for the most part, and also there's a difference of like jurisdiction over healthcare. But in case of South Korea and Singapore specifically, they have pandemic-specific laws that were created after SARS and MERS, and I'm wondering or thinking there may be a possibility that we may be seeing more of those types of legislations popping around the world.
And then Dongwoo, the last question could be for you as well. Do the data sets track the degree of emphasis on privacy protection in the Asia-Pacific jurisdictions?
No, not really. We wish that we could do that, but then it's not, again, like I think privacy entails a lot of, you have to bring in the context, like, is it the industry or is it the government? What about the effectiveness of civil society organizations? So there are so many factors in play, and I didn't feel like we had the capacity to capture that within this map. But privacy is a topic that we are really interested in, and we pitched some proposals earlier this year as well with ChinaUS. And we're hoping to do more in-depth work and develop capacity to address some of the issues like that.
And for those that aren't completely familiar with Dongwoo's work, he also works very closely on issues around ethics and technology in the Asia Pacific, which of course will be, I think, another very important parallel to some of the data that we've seen and some of the uses of technology that we're seeing around pandemic responses. So do watch the foundation for some of his work in the future, where he'll be looking, I think, more specifically at some of these issues. But thank you very much, Hiroshi, Dongwoo, and Pauline. You presented, I think, very interesting data sets. I genuinely believe that none of us could have done this without a whole of a foundation approach to this. This was a very big research project for those that were not able to present, but that contributed a lot of their time and effort to collecting the data and helping us understand the data. Thank you very much. For those that have participated as attendees on this conference, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I hope that you found this presentation interesting and informative. Please do visit our website and have a look at the map. As I said, there's a lot more there than we could possibly have presented over the course of an hour. And in many ways, you can customize your experience and your interaction with the map in ways that make more sense for your particular interests. So do take the time to visit. If you have not subscribed to our Asia Watch weekly, tri-weekly mail out, please do so. We try to track what we think are the most important issues in the Asia Pacific with reference back to Canada. And a lot of what we do on the Asia Watch ultimately ends up informing our broader research agenda as well. So if you want a sneak peek of where some of the work we are going to be doing is coming from, the Asia Watch is a good place to start. So thank you very much. And we do look forward in talking more to those individuals that indicated that they'd be interested in collaboration going forward. We'll follow up directly with you as well, as we did get you to self-identifying the question and answers, but hopefully we'll hear from you before that. But thank you very much. And again, thank you panelists for your very interesting presentations. Good afternoon and thank you.